Settle in now. Allow your shoulders to soften, your breath to slow. The world beyond your blanket will wait. This is your time to drift. Tonight, let us slip quietly into a world long gone. A world of wooden bowls, flickering hearth fires, and bread not quite as you'd imagine it. The Middle Ages, a time shrouded in mystery, drenched in myth and often misunderstood. But beneath the tales of knights and castles lies something far more tangible and far less romantic. The food. Tonight, we explore the humble, often dismal world of medieval cuisine. Not the banquets of kings, though we'll visit those too, but the everyday fare, the weary labourer's ration, the strange, enduring survival strategies of an age without refrigeration, seasoning, or sometimes even understanding of hygiene. You may never look at your pantry the same way again. So breathe in, and let's begin. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn. Your bed, nothing more than straw-stuffed sacking laid across rough wooden boards. You are a peasant and unlanded labourer in a small English village sometime around the year 1272. The morning is chill, not with frost, but with the damp breath of the thatched roof above. A low fire has smouldered overnight, more for safety than warmth, and smoke curls faintly from the hearth. It is not just heat that's lacking, but also breakfast. Your first meal of the day is not what we would call breakfast. In truth, it is barely a meal at all. Perhaps a crust of yesterday's bread, coarse and dark, made from a mix of barley, rye, and whatever other grain could be scrounged or afforded. Wheat was rare, a luxury, and white bread? That was a thing for nobles, made from sifted flour far removed from your reach. This bread might be dipped into a thin potager, watery stew of legumes, or grain boiled in water. If you were lucky, it had been thickened with a root vegetable, like turnip or parsnip. Salt was a precious commodity, and spices virtually unknown in your home. The flavour is faint, more texture than taste. Midday approaches. This is your main meal, the one that must sustain you through hours of physical labour. You return from the fields or your craft to gather with family or neighbours. Again, the staple is pottage. It is always pottage. A different pot might simmer, yes, but the contents rarely vary. Lentils, onions if they're in season, dried peas perhaps. Occasionally, a knuckle bone or a scrap of fat might have been added reused for days to lend some depth. Meat is reserved for feast days, which means perhaps only a handful of times per year. When it does appear, it is often heavily salted, dried, or smoked to extend its shelf life. The process alters both taste and texture. Imagine something akin to jerky, soaked in water, boiled until chewable. Fresh vegetables, too, are seasonal. In winter, you might rely on stored root crops and sour cabbage. There are no tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn. Those would not arrive from the New World for centuries yet. The diet is fundamentally local, monotonous, and shaped more by survival than pleasure. Even your ale, the drink of choice, is not quite what modern tastes would expect. Weak, cloudy, and barely alcoholic, it is brewed quickly and consumed young. It is not meant for enjoyment, but for hydration. Water was often unsafe, and ale could mask that danger with bubbles and barley. In the evening, after the long shadow of sunset, your meal might be no more than a reheated bowl from earlier, perhaps a few nuts if gathered, or a withered apple stored since harvest. You might end your day chewing on cheese so hard it must be soaked before eating. This cheese, aged for preservation, can last months, but also grows tougher with time. The air is tinged with smoke, both from your hearth and from the walls themselves, blackened by years of cooking and close quarters. Insects are a constant presence, no matter the season, and you have no window to speak of, just a hole, perhaps with oiled cloth to block wind. In this world, food is survival, not delight. Now and again, a fair or festival might come, with honey cakes or roasted meat, a tankard of something stronger, but for the most part, the culinary world of the medieval poor was defined by sameness, sustenance over satisfaction. And so, as you settle once more into your bed of straw, belly neither full nor empty, the scent of stale grain and distant ash lingers in your nostrils. This was life, repeating, simple, enduring, but undeniably dull. While most of the medieval population subsisted on brown bread and weak ale, the upper crust nobility, clergy, and wealthy merchants experienced an entirely different culinary reality. Yet even this world of feasting and fine ingredients was not as indulgent or flavorful as one might imagine. Let us drift now into the banquet hall, where the meals are grand in form, but often curious in substance. Imagine yourself now in a great hall, its ceiling lost in shadow, wooden beams charred from decades of torchlight. Long tables stretch out before you, and a fire roars in the hearth, scenting the air with a mixture of smoke and roasting flesh. The lord of the manor sits at the high table, slightly elevated, surrounded by retainers and favoured guests. Below, the lower tables host lesser figures still noble, but of a lesser standing in this rigid hierarchy. Servants bustle about, setting down trenchers-thick slabs of coarse bread used as edible plates. Upon these will soon rest roasted meats, elaborate pies, and moulded jellies. The feast begins not with soup or salad, but with spectacle. Peacocks are brought to table, feathers reattached to their cooked flesh to preserve their majestic appearance. Swans, too, with necks arched high, are consumed more for status than satisfaction. The meat is often tough, the flavour gamey. Spices are used in abundance not for taste alone, but as a symbol of wealth and power. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper these came from distant lands, carried along trade routes, fraught with danger, and thus priced accordingly. But these spices, while lavish, are often misused. Recipes from noble households reveal combinations that may feel strange to modern palates: fish cooked in almond milk, or eels baked into sweet custards. The concept of sweet and savoury as distinct courses did not exist. Instead, dishes mingled these elements freely: a stew of chicken, dates, and vinegar, or a pie of minced meat with prunes and sugar. Salt, so rare in the common home, is present in abundance here, yet its purpose is often to preserve, not to flavour. Meats are heavily salted to survive transport or storage, and when served, the salt remains, giving a sharpness that cuts against the richness of the dish. Wine flows at the high table, but it too is different, often spiced, sometimes thickened with honey or herbs, and almost always mixed with water. Drinking wine pure was seen as crude. Clarity was not expected. Sediment was common. These were not the crisp varietals of modern vineyards, but something heavier, often stored in wooden barrels that flavoured the contents with age and resin. Even the bread is different. White, fine-milled, and sifted to remove the bran known as manchet bread, it is soft, closer to cake than the gritty loaves of the peasantry. This bread, too, signals status, and is often served in large, decorative rounds. Despite the abundance, there is little in the way of balance or nutrition. Vegetables are scorned as peasant fare, though they may appear disguised in pies or sauces. Fresh greens, when present, are wilted into stews or presented as purees. Raw salads are rare and viewed with suspicion. The experience of dining is not private or serene. Feasts are loud, public performances with music, jesters, and processions between courses. Etiquette is complex though. Not wipe your hands on the tablecloth. Do not reach across the trenchers, and never bite into your bread unless the Lord has done so first. Servants stand behind each guest, ready to pour, carve, or clear. After hours of feasting, guests depart or retire, bellies stretched, yet not always satisfied. The food may have been grand in name, but heavy in reality. Much of it was more about display of wealth, of connections, of knowledge of foreign ingredients, than about flavour or enjoyment. And once the feast ended, the trencher soaked with meat juices and sauces were not discarded, but gathered. Some might be given to the poor, others fed to dogs. Even in this, the hierarchy of the table remains clear. Thus, while the food of the noble was richer, it was not necessarily better. It was a cuisine of performance and power, less about comfort, more about control. And so we drift away from the high table, where even delicacies could become burdens. Let us now pass beyond the living, and into the silent world of the buried. In the quiet layers beneath ruined abbeys, forgotten hearths and crumbled manors, archaeologists uncover faint echoes of what was once eaten, grown, or longed for. Through fragments of bone, scorched grains, and broken pottery, we begin to see just how strange and sparse the medieval diet could be, not just through records, but through remains. Close your eyes and picture a dig cyclo mounds of soil under a cold grey sky, perhaps somewhere in the fens of England. A trench reveals the outline of a long-decayed cottage. In the packed dirt of its floor are dark stains where pots once sat and coals once burned. Around the perimeter, the soil yields clues. Sheep bones, mostly rib and leg, hinting at butchery. Nearby, a cache of fish banestini, delicate, from river perch or eel. Yet most striking is the absence of luxury. There are no olive pits, no grape seeds, no citrus rind. These were foreign, costly, and vanishingly rare. Instead, one finds barley husks, oat kernels, and pulsis lentils, peas, chickpeas. Coarse grains dominate, often charred, remnants of flatbreads or porridge, baked directly on hot stones. In the garbage pits, those ancient, invaluable repositories lie more subtle stories. Scattered oyster shells, for instance. Today, a delicacy. In the Middle Ages, oysters were food for the poor, easily gathered along the coast. Their presence in urban refuse layers, far from the sea, speaks to trade and preservation, often in brine or vinegar. Animal remains tell a tale of utility more than enjoyment. Pigs, especially, were raised not for their meat alone, but for their ability to eat waste and survive on little. The bones of older animals indicating long use before slaughter appear often. Chickens, too, were kept mainly for eggs, and their bones show signs of late-age butchery. Cows were prized more for milk and labour. Meat was secondary. Even fish bones hold clues. In monastic settlements, where meat was forbidden for large portions of the year, fish was central. Yet overfishing was not uncommon. Archaeological strata show a shift from large river fish to smaller, less desirable species over time, suggesting depletion of local stocks. Beyond the physical remains, scientists now study the residues in pottery. Burnt residues scraped from ceramic interiors can be analysed, revealing traces of milk, honey, or meat fats. Some show evidence of long boiling, suggestive of soups or stews cooked over embers for hours perhaps to tenderize sinewy cuts or mask age. There is even evidence of early food fraud. In some city digs, remains of bread baked with ground chalk or clay have been found, fillers used to stretch flour in lean times or by dishonest bakers. The gritty texture of such loaves would wear down teeth over years, and indeed, medieval skeletons show severe dental abrasion, not from sugar, but from stone grit and mineral impurities in flour. Then there is the mystery of what cannot be seen. Absences tell stories too. In many rural areas, fruit seeds are almost non-existent in dig layers. This suggests that fresh fruit so basic to modern diets was largely seasonal, or absent altogether. Apples were sour, pears gritty, and both were often cooked down or dried to survive past harvest. Finally, across countless sites, are shards of pottery coarse, utilitarian, handmade. These were not plates as we know them, but small cookpots or bowls. Serving ware was rare. Food was often consumed directly from cooking vessels or off-shared trenchers. Meals were communal, but humble, with little waste because there was little to spare. And so, through the earth and ash, a picture emerges not just of what people ate, but how they survived. Archaeology reveals not opulence, but endurance. A table bare by modern standards, yet full of meaning. And in these remnants, the quiet testimony of millions who ate simply and vanished silently into the soil. As we drift from the ancient earth and its silent clues, we now turn our gaze upward into the towering structures of society itself. For in the medieval world, food was never just nourishment. It was power, it was identity, and most of all, it was uneven. Imagine a market day in a small medieval town. The square is bustling, stalls covered with rough canvas offer barley, dried beans, and aging onions. A boy shouts about saltfish hauled in from the coast last week. Nearby, a baker tends to small loaves blackened at the edges, their scent thin and sour. These are the provisions for the average person, humble, seasonal, and meagre. Yet, only a few streets away, the manor kitchens are preparing for a visiting dignitary. The kitchen staff are busy trussing a goose, seasoning venison with imported spices, and shaping marzipan into tiny animals for decoration. The contrast is stark. In one corner of the world, people count beans to survive the winter. In another, they discard the roast ends because they cool too fast. This disparity was not incidental, it was institutional. In most villages, labourers received food as part of their wages, but the quality and quantity were rigidly controlled. A tenant farmer might receive a daily ration of grain or ale, yet never taste the meat he helped raise. Shepherds, dairymen, even skilled blacksmiths rarely touched fresh produce during colder months. Their diet depended almost entirely on what they could: store roots, grains, hard cheese, and salted fats. Meanwhile, clergy and noble households were bound not just by access to food, but by elaborate rules around how to serve and eat it. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, upper-class kitchens devised intricate substitutions fish, shaped to look like meat pies, almond milk standing in for dairy, eggs painted and hollowed to deceive the eye, not necessarily out of piety, but out of a desire to preserve culinary privilege. This divide extended to social rituals. Poor villagers might eat communally, from shared bowls, seated around a hearth. A single wooden spoon could serve a household. In contrast, nobles were taught complex table manners, including how to carve meats properly, how to dip fingers into rosewater between courses, and when to wipe one's mouth with a linen cloth. Even hospitality was stratified. A passing traveller might find a place at a villager's fire, offered soup and rough bread. But gaining entrance to a noble feast required status or favour. Inns, when they appeared, served stew of uncertain origin, watered wine, and stale bread unless one paid dearly. Hunger, too, did not strike equally. Famine recurred throughout the medieval centuries, famously between 1315 and 1317, during the Great Famine of Europe. Yet even during this terrible period, noble estates fared better. Grain stores were hoarded, markets manipulated, and serfs required to surrender portions of their own crops in payment. In castles, rations were cut, but never erased. In villages, entire family starved. Food, then, was a mirror of one's place in the world. Your access to it, your right to grow it, to cook it, even to taste it, was determined by the land you held or did not hold. Men and women could be born into hunger and die never having known satiety. And so, meals were not merely about sustenance. They were daily, quiet reminders of who held power and who did not. Now, as twilight settles once more upon the countryside in your mind, the market stalls close, and the manor's kitchens fall silent, bellies filled or not, status reinforced. And the long night begins, in hunger or in ease. Let us now meander down the winding lane of medieval medicine and its curious relationship with food. In an age before nutrition science, understanding what was good to eat and what might make you ill rested not on observation, but on theory. And these theories, though earnestly applied, often did more to confuse than to heal. Close your eyes and imagine a small herbarium tucked behind a monastery. Wooden shelves stacked with bundles of drying plants, and a musty scent of thyme, wormwood, and damp parchment fills the air. Here, monks record recipes and treatments based not on testing, but on inherited knowledge, especially the ancient Greco-Roman concept of the four humours. According to this system, the body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each corresponded to elements, seasons, even emotions. To stay healthy, one had to keep these humours in balance, and food was considered the primary method of doing so. Foods, too, were categorized by humoral qualities. Some were hot and dry, others cold and moist. Pork, for instance, was considered moist and cold, suitable for certain temperaments, but dangerous for others. Beef was hot and dry, and thus only to be eaten by strong-bodied individuals, certainly not by children, women, or the frail. Cucumbers were feared as excessively cold and moist, potentially dangerous, unless cooked with warming spices like ginger or pepper. These beliefs led to elaborate instructions in cookbooks and health guides. For example, eels were deemed cold and moist, potentially corrupting. To correct this, they were fried with sage and vinegar, or even stuffed with warming herbs. Milk was believed to cause phlegm and melancholy. Fruit was dangerous unless stewed. Raw greens? Almost never. And cold water? Risky to drink under nearly any circumstances. Bread, the most basic staple, was likewise not exempt. Fine white bread was thought to be more digestible than coarse dark loaves. Stale bread was sometimes preferred to fresh, which was considered too moist and likely to swell in the belly. Spices like cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg were praised not for their taste, but for their warming, balancing properties. These beliefs extended even into times of illness. A fever might be treated with cooling foods like lettuce, soup, or barley. Water, while chills might require hot, dry dishes, such as roasted game meat, seasoned with mustard. Doctors, more often, barbers or wise women prescribed these dietary remedies as carefully as we might use medication today. And then there were the remedies born of desperation. Plague doctors, though rare, recommended mixtures of crushed emeralds, vinegar-soaked bread, or ground mummy, literally the powdered remains of ancient embalmed body as preventive treatments. Garlic was hung in doorways, onions eaten raw to draw out poison, and wine mixed with crushed herbs for purification. Hygiene, too, influenced diet. Without refrigeration, preservation became a matter of necessity. Salted meats, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables dominated pantries. But this led to excessive salt consumption and vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy was not understood, but it was experienced limbs aching, gums bleeding, and fatigue overwhelming. It was simply called the wasting sickness. And for the lower classes, the idea of balancing humours was a distant concern. Their meals were chosen not for health, but for survival. If pottage was the only food on hand, then its moist and cold nature was of little interest. There was no alternative. The luxury of aligning diet with theory belonged to those who could afford options. Even among the elite, following humoral advice could lead to absurd extremes. Some nobles consumed wine laced with crushed pearls or gold leaf, believing it would restore warmth and vitality. Others shunned certain fruits their entire lives, warned by astrologers and physicians that the stars and their stomachs were ill-aligned. Thus, food in the Middle Ages was more than fuel. It was medicine, symbol, and ritual, guided by invisible forces, governed by unseen fluids, and dictated by physicians whose best tools were ink and guesswork. And so, we move gently onward, through the strange terrain of medieval health, where dinner could be a cure, a danger, or a prayer. As we travel quietly onward, let us leave behind the cold manners of Northern Europe and explore how geography shaped the medieval table. For while much of the era's food was bland or burdensome, it wasn't the same everywhere. The climate, soil, proximity to trade, and even religion all dictated what people ate and what they dreamed of eating. Imagine now that you are in a sunny village nestled on the Italian peninsula, perhaps in the hills of Tuscany. The landscape is dotted with olive groves and vineyards, the air dry and sweet. Here, food is already slightly different. Instead of barley and oats, you may find a greater abundance of wheat and, thus, better bread. Though still coarse by modern standards, it is lighter than the dark loaves of England. Olive oil flows more freely in southern climates, used for cooking, for preservation, for anointing. Its role in the kitchen is central. Animal fats are less common, though still present in wealthier homes. Vegetables are more abundant here too. Chickpeas, lentils, and fava beans make regular appearances, alongside cabbages, onions, and garlic. Though still boiled or stewed, they appear more frequently than in northern counterparts. And yet, even here, the spectre of humoral medicine still looms. Hot climates called for cooling foods, and cooks followed the same strange balancing acts, mixing eggplant with vinegar, sweetening meat with dried fruits, and avoiding overly fresh cheese. Now let the breeze carry us eastward, into the Byzantine Empire. Here, the cuisine is deeply entwined with both Roman heritage and Eastern influence. Spices arrive more readily via the Silk Road, and sugar is more common, still expensive, but not unthinkable. Almonds are used to make milk substitutes, and rice has begun to appear in the diet of the wealthy. Dishes are flavoured with mint, cinnamon, and lemon juice, creating a distinctly Mediterranean palate. Further north and west, across the Channel, in Normandy or Flanders, food becomes heavier again. The weather is colder, the seasons shorter. Here, butter and lard are more common than olive oil, and cabbages, leeks, and turnips dominate gardens. Herring is ubiquitous, pickled, dried, or salted and served alongside dark rye breads. In Germanic regions, beer begins to take a firmer hold than wine. It is darker, stronger, and consumed in great quantity not only for its taste, but for its role as safe hydration. Sausages and preserved meats become more prominent. Sauerkraut, rich in vitamin C, provides a rare dietary advantage over other regions during the long winters. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, the influence of the Islamic world brings remarkable contrast. In Al-Andalus, now southern Spain, irrigation technologies allow for citrus orchards, rice paddies, and the cultivation of exotic herbs. Meals include pomegranate seeds, saffron-scented rice, and sweet pastries filled with almond paste and honey. These dishes reflect not only flavor, but a blending of cultures Arabic, Jewish, and Christian. Even religion carves lines into the diet. Christians fast on Fridays and during Lent, avoiding meat. Muslims avoid pork and consume dates during religious feasts. Jews follow kosher laws, which restrict combinations of meat and dairy. These dietary customs shape markets, kitchens, and agricultural practices across regions. Trade routes, too, dictate diets. Coastal cities like Venice, Bruges, or Bordeaux say imports from afar. Spices, sugar, dried fruits, even rare goods like rice and exotic wines. Inland towns rely more heavily on local crops and preserved foods. And so, the medieval diet, while often bleak, is far from uniform. It is as much a product of place as of time. A peasant in the Scottish Highlands and a merchant in Cairo may have shared little more than the idea that food was precious and fleeting. Tonight, we've walked through forests and crossed seas in our quiet tour. And in each region, the table may look a little different, but the struggle remains. To eat enough, to eat safely, and occasionally, to eat well. Now, as twilight settles deeper over the medieval landscape, let us turn to the quiet art and daily struggle of keeping food from spoiling. For in an age without refrigeration or reliable storage, the line between nourishment and poison was often terribly thin. Every household, from hovel to castle, was locked in a constant battle against rot, mold, and infestation. Imagine a medieval kitchen. Dark, drafty, and filled with the scent of wood smoke. Hooks hang from blackened beams, supporting strings of onions, bunches of herbs, and bundles of dried fish. Below, heavy clay jars rest in shadowy corners, sealed with wax or covered with cloth soaked in brine. This is not a place of abundance, but a place of cautious calculation. In the absence of cooling technology, preservation relied on a few rudimentary techniques: drying, salting, smoking, pickling, and fermenting. Each was imperfect. Each had its costs. Salting was perhaps the most common. Meat or fish would be packed tightly in layers of salt, expensive and precious in itself. This drew out moisture, killing or inhibiting bacteria. But the result was tough. Intensely salty fare. Before it could be eaten, the food would need soaking in multiple changes of water, sometimes for days. Even then, the taste could be harsh, the texture unpleasant. Yet it was safer at least. Safer. Smoking offered another method. Fish and pork especially were suspended over smouldering fires, often for hours or days. The smoke dried the surface and infused it with preservative compounds. But smoked foods absorbed the taste of whatever fuel was used. In poorer homes, where green wood or dung might be burned, this could lend a bitter, acrid flavour. Drying was used widely. Grains, beans, and fruit could be sun-dried or oven-dried. Apples sliced thin, plums shriveled into prunes. These would be stored in sacks or jars, with care taken to keep out damp and rodents. Mice were constant threats, and even in noble homes, storerooms were patrolled by cats or traps baited with precious crumbs. Fermentation was another marvel of medieval ingenuity. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut. Milk became cheese or sour curds. Leftover dough became sourdough starters. Fermentation not only preserved food, it could make it more digestible, more flavorful, even more nutritious. But it required attention. A misstep could breed illness instead of sustenance. Pickling, too, played a key role. Eggs, onions, and even fish might be submerged in vinegar or brine. The tang of pickled food was not always welcomed, but it was tolerated, particularly in winter months, when freshness was only a memory. Grain, so fundamental to the medieval diet, brought its own challenges. Stored improperly, it could become infested with weevils or rot from dampness. Worse still, rye stored in poor conditions could develop ergota, toxic mold that, when baked into bread, caused hallucinations, convulsions, or death. Entire villages have been speculated to fall under the sway of this invisible enemy, though the people then had no name for Itonly, the sense that the bread had betrayed them. In the best of times, food spoiled quietly. A loaf grew mold, a cask turned sour, a sausage grew slick with age. In the worst of times, food became the agent of sickness and death. And so, vigilance was constant. Smell, sight, and superstition guided decisions. Some believed garlic or ash could ward off spoilage. Others trusted the phases of the moon. The poorest often had no choice. They ate what was available, fresh or not. Even cooking itself served preservation. Long boiling, frequent in medieval recipes, was not merely a taste preference, it helped destroy contaminants. Stews were safer than roasts, and bread safer than raw grain. Spices, though rare for the lower classes, were sometimes added less for flavour and more for their supposed purifying qualities. Food was not wasteful. Bones were boiled into broth, stale bread fried in fat or turned into puddings. Cheese rinds were scraped and reused. Leftovers were rare, and when they did exist, they were repurposed with care. And so we see, behind every bite in the medieval world, an invisible struggle. Against time, against decay, against the creeping mould and lurking insect. Preservation was not convenience, it was survival. Now the fire burns lower in our imagined kitchen. The last pot has been stirred, the jars sealed, the bread wrapped in cloth. All is quiet and still uncertain. As we approach the end of our journey through medieval meals, let us open the quiet pages of some of the world's earliest cookbooks. Though few could read them and fewer still could afford the ingredients, they offer a window into how the people of the Middle Ages thought about food, flavour, and status. Picture a heavy manuscript, bound in worn leather and speckled with grease marks. It rests on a lectern in the corner of a noble's kitchen, or a wealthy monastery's scriptorium. The ink is brown with age, the script elegant but laborious. Within, recipes flow not as lists and steps, but as prosagental, meandering instructions shaped by oral tradition. One of the oldest English cookbooks is the Form of Cury, compiled in the late 14th century by the master cooks of King Richard II. Its title, Cury, derives from the Middle French choir, to cook, and yet the contents are not simply culinary. They are cultural, medical, and symbolic. Here, we find recipes that astonish. Blanc manger, a dish of shredded chicken and rice thickened with almond milk and sugar. Or petit penantes, tiny stuffed birds seasoned with cloves and boiled in spiced wine. There are complex sauces involving verjuice, a tart liquid from unripe grapes, ginger, and even ground galangala, relative of ginger imported from Southeast Asia. Quantities are rarely specified. One must know, or guess. A recipe might begin, take goat flesh of hennies, and boil hem in goat broth, but never quite say how much broth, how many hens, or for how long. This was intentional. These books were guides for the trained those already familiar with fire and mortar, blade and ladle. Measurement systems were rudimentary. Instructions such as thick as a man's finger, or the bigness of an egg, were common. Temperature control was non-existent. Cooks judged heat by feel, by sight, by the sound of simmering liquid, or the color of singed onions. Many recipes focus not on creating something new, but on transforming one thing into another. A common dish called fake roast used pounded fish shaped into meatballs and coated in breadcrumbs to resemble roasted fowl. Another involved forming rice paste into the shape of peacock eggs. Food was entertainment and disguise. Color played a surprisingly central role. Recipes called for saffron to create golden hues, ground herbs to color sauces green, and crushed red berries to mimic blood. Some cooks used edible silver or gold leaf to gild pastries for display. Even the humblest of kitchens sometimes attempted to imitate this grandeur on feast days using beets for coloring or flour molded into mock meats. For the illiterate majority, knowledge of recipes passed orally mother to daughter, master to apprentice, priest to monk. Rural dishes rarely changed. They were simple, dictated by the seasons and the tools on hand. Pottage, griddle cakes, baked apples. But even these had variations. A handful of nettles, a pinch of dried sage, or the rare indulgence of honey could shift the experience subtly. The church, too, issued dietary guidance. Days of fasting were frequent nearly half the year for devout Christians. This spawned innovations such as mock meats and fish-based substitutes. Monastic cookbooks offer bland but creative ideas. Boiled eggs mashed with herbs to resemble minced meat. Pastries filled with sweetened bean paste to mimic more luxurious fare. Elsewhere in Europe, cookbooks began to reflect regional tastes. The Catalan llibre de Saint-Sauvy blended Moorish influences with Mediterranean simplicity, recipes using saffron, almonds, and rosewater. In Germany, Das Buch von guter Speise, the Book of Good Food, offered detailed instructions for hearty stews, dumplings, and jellies. Despite their complexity, these books were rarely about daily sustenance. They were aspirational, ceremonial, and performative, used to impress guests, demonstrate wealth, or uphold tradition. They told not of hunger, but of triumph over it. And so, through the crooked lines of medieval handwriting, we glimpse not only what people ate but what they wished to eat, what they considered worthy of celebration, what they found beautiful, curious, or sacred in their kitchens. The last page turns. The manuscript closes. A puff of flour drifts from the binding, and the air is still. We leave behind not only the ingredients, but the intent, the endless striving to make food something more than fuel, something to share, to remember, to imagine. And now, dear listener, we return from our journey through soot-dark kitchens, over-salted stews, and forgotten feasts. The candles have burned low in the medieval halls, the trenchers cleared away, the pots scrubbed and turned upside down for the night. The people we've met, peasants, monks, merchants, noble shave, long since laid down their tools and gone to sleep beneath thatched roofs and stone vaults, their stomachs quieted, if not satisfied. What remains with us is not just what they ate, but what their meals meant. Food, in the Middle Ages, was a language of class, of culture, of coping. It was a message whispered across centuries. This is what we had. This is how we endured. Perhaps now, tucked into your own bed, you hear the soft hum of a refrigerator, the click of a distant street lamp, the faint scent of clean linen and lavender. So much has changed. What was once exotic sugar, pepper, orangesis, now within arm's reach. What was once survival pottage, pickles, salted fishes, now choice or curiosity. We eat not only for need, but for joy, for comfort, for connection. You might drift to sleep tonight with a quiet appreciation, knowing that your next meal will not be boiled barley or onion broth. And if you do wake hungry, the answer will not lie in the smoky air of a windowless cottage, but in something warm and waiting just beyond your kitchen door. So breathe in deeply. Let the echoes of grinding millstones and bubbling pots fade. The Middle Ages are behind us now. Their food was strange, humble, and often hard to swallow. But through it, we find a human story, resilient, inventive, and always hungry for more. Sleep well, traveller. Tomorrow holds softer bread.